All right, so Gary, we get to talk about something that I think is definitely of interest for many people. You were brought into a situation that was seemingly dire, and you had to kind of make some changes. So, can you just kind of a little bit briefly tell us the situation that you were brought into, kind of like one of those situations where, in case of emergency, break glass and call Gary. So you got that phone call, and then what happened?
Yeah, so I came in, and my name is Gary Brantley. I want to start off by that. I know she said it. I'm the Chief Information Officer for the City of Atlanta. And so, reliving these events, I was not in the city on that day, that actual day, but I was called later on to come in and really help resolve this issue. And so in March of 2018, the city of Atlanta probably had one of the biggest cyber attacks in the history of the United States. It was extremely crippling, and it probably was the biggest cyber attack for a city government entity ever. And it was, of course, it's Atlanta, and it was publicized heavily. And so, I received a call to come in and really, provide assistance around this. And so, when you get these calls and you're called to help to lead around these types of disaster situations, you walk into complete chaos. And so we had a theme. We had to establish a theme around really getting back to operational basics. I didn't really, and I was telling Rick earlier, I didn't really need to see much. You had individuals that said, hey, you can count on me going forward. And I was telling them I had about 2.5 to 3 years of data I could look at, to make a decision on whether or not you needed to take this journey with us. And so, needless to say, a lot of chaos, a lot of lessons learned, and we'll get into that, as we continue to talk forward. But, just imagine not really being able to do much from a city service perspective.
So that's very interesting, and I just jumped straight into it. So I'm Rick Piña as well. It was introduced, but I came from the Army. I spent 25 years in the Army. I retired as the CTO. I'm at Worldwide Technology now. And from an Army perspective, we did train quite a bit for these type of situations. And whenever there was something that we would consider to be a failure, and obviously in this case, this would be considered something that would be within that category, one of the things that we often said was we should not miss the opportunity to capitalize on failure and to learn as much as we can from that failure, because that failure, and often, from a military perspective, we would call it a forcing function. It would give us the ability to make some changes that maybe we would not have outside of that forcing function. So you coming in, this was definitely a forcing function. What did you learn as an organization, as a city, from the failure? And then how did you maximize that opportunity to posture yourself for the future?
So let's talk about this. That's a very good question. So the first thing I looked at was, man, should I take this government job where it's going to be slow, probably not going to have much money, but guess what? This is a great opportunity because, there's a failure in front of us that is going to force you to spend money. It's going to allow decisions that you wouldn't normally be able to make. You can make them quickly. And so, going through that was the first decision I made going in. But the second decision I made is, man, I have to sell the idea of working for a city to some really talented individuals. How can I sell them? What can we talk about? And so I went out. I found a great CTO from Lockheed. I went out and found a CISO from Travelport. And so what did they say to me? Oh, no, I can't do that. You don't pay enough. I don't want to do this job. So I started with people, right? Because I didn't have a lot of time for a culture change. And one of the things that we really started to learn is that we had to go back through the entire city and explain to them that these things are inevitable. Right? And so we came up with a theme called Preparing for the Inevitable. And so one of the things that we learned is that we have to really continue to, impart knowledge on our user base around these things really happening, but also how can we explain to them how we're growing from a maturity standpoint in the cybersecurity space without it being so deep. and muddled from a technology perspective. And so, as we started to move through, a couple of things we learned. We needed to communicate better. When these things happen, and you guys have probably heard this early on today, you really shouldn't be looking at the playbook on day one. That's the first thing. You're from the Army, Rick. You talk about muscle memory. We talked about that backstage, and so we really needed to get our muscle memory up for disasters. And I gave an example back in the room that I was really enamored from an education perspective, how students and kids, when they have fire drills, when they have tornado drills, they know exactly what to do. Period. When it happens, active shooter, boom, get down, bend, go to this area. They practice. From a cybersecurity perspective, you don't really see that a lot. And if you do see it, those organizations are really good. So we knew we had to get better from that perspective. So even for the Super Bowl, we established, I was able to come in a tabletop exercise where we were able to really get on the same page, not just with the city of Atlanta, but also big companies like Equifax, companies like Delta, Coca-Cola, all of the major companies that sit within the city of Atlanta, including universities and also federal and state entities. We were all on the same page, probably close to 150 people going over scenarios of what could happen during the Super Bowl, how would we handle it, and also getting as granular as establishing one platform. So we knew, number two, that we had to use and leverage the individuals that were around us. That's the second piece. The third thing is, and what we learned is people forget quickly. Although cybersecurity has to have muscle memory, you would be surprised at how quickly, when these things happen, people forget that it can happen. And so one of the big things, we're saying is this can happen again. This can happen again. The question is, how prepared will we be for it to happen again? So I would say those three areas are areas that it's not about the technology. Right, it rarely ever is. Typically in most cases, so we didn't learn much about that except that maybe we had people in place that didn't have, the right levels, sets, and all those different types of things, the governance and the strategy in place to really move forward to protect us. But I would say communication and how we handle disasters was probably the biggest lesson we took from this.
It sounds like you're making the most of this opportunity to make some significant changes, which is great, because it is a force and function that you probably won't have again for a long time. I would venture to say that you would not have gotten 150 people together from disparate agencies had it not been for what happened. So from that perspective, the tabletop exercise is actually a military term, TTX. We did a lot of tabletop exercises in the military, and I was sharing with you backstage that we, as a young soldier, I hated it, that we would, just train, and initially we had the term that you have to train as you fight, but we trained so much to where we had the muscle memory, we knew what we were going to do if something were to happen, to where eventually we changed the connotation from train as you fight to fight as you train. And so now that you are, like you said, there's two aspects to what we do. There's the technology side, the infrastructure, and you could break that up into IT operations and security operations and et cetera. There's some things that you can do around automation and orchestration and technology and et cetera. But at the end of the day, the hardest part is dealing with people and business processes. So can you speak to a little bit from an organizational perspective, what you've had to do to kind of posture yourself beyond what you're doing now, like the tabletop exercises and bringing in external agencies, but what are you doing internally, like the synergies between the CIO, CTO, CISO, and et cetera?
Yeah, those are always interesting dynamics. One of the things that, I kind of mentioned earlier from a people perspective is, when you're trying to change culture, when you're trying to go through, transformative things with an organization, you don't have a lot of time to teach that, especially in organizations that you walk in that have had huge failures. And so, one of the things that I spent and even my team spent a lot of time on is really using this force-in function to really go out and find the right individuals with the right mindset that could permeate cultural expectations down through the organization. And that's been a fight. And what I've learned in some cases, even when you're dealing with security, it's not necessarily, or just functions in general in technology, it's not necessarily that they don't want to do it. In a lot of cases, they don't know how. And so, one of the things that I always say is that, sometimes you walk into organizations that have never seen how to be great. And so, one of the big advantages of jumping from sometimes company to company, at some point, you're going to walk into something that's great. And so, we talk about this over and over and over again. How do we change culture, right? That's number one. Sometimes you take 2 steps forward to take 1 step back. That's number 2. But that doesn't mean you are not progressing. And so, the third piece is it's at a level, and I'll say this to all CIOs, you at some point have to keep a pulse on the network infrastructure. You can't completely take your hands off of it, and you have to monitor that expectation. We do the same thing for culture. It is constantly monitored, engaged. It is a conversation at the front of our agenda because it controls so much. It controls how we move forward as an organization. And so, the biggest thing I would say is we're extremely intentional about the type of culture that we want now moving forward.
One of the things I thought was interesting as we were preparing for this session, I found out that for a portion of time, the city actually went back to paper. When you mentioned like operating on paper, right? And so I was in the Army when we transitioned after the initial invasion into Iraq in 2004. We transitioned the Army from a microwave network or a terrestrial-based network to a satellite-based architecture. And because of that, we had this unique requirement to be able to operate in discontiguous battle space and to be able to deploy anywhere in the world with short notice, with the capability to fight upon arrival. That really drove us towards a satellite-based architecture. However, we were really dependent on satellite. So we would have these exercises to say, what would it look like if you didn't have satellite? Like, what would a day without satellite or a day without space look like? Well, in your case, you actually lived it. So how did, several days in your case without the network, going back to paper, what did that teach you as an organization, as a city? And then what did that really teach you about your critical functions and the things that you should enable with the network?
So let's start with this, right? This was the first time that I felt that it was extremely advantageous to not have many millennials on staff or in the city, right? With that being said, it really gave us an opportunity to use what I would say expertise from those seasoned individuals who had seen it before, right? And so, and this is we talk about, a mix of the old and the new. And so it wasn't as big of a shift as you would think. Of course, like I said, with an aging workforce, and everybody knows that's typically the case in government, we were able to take advantage of that, but it was also lessons learned for those other individuals that when technology fails, how are you prepared to handle it? And so we just had this conversation. We're going through a business continuity and disaster recovery initiative, and those were some of the big questions asked because we just had to live it. But the good part is we were able to still get things done, and we had an advantage. We talked about this the other day. Yeah, we may have had to go to paper to pay your court bill or whatever, but guess what? You still had to pay it. So, it wasn't a big loss of revenue. You didn't get away from what you were obligated to do. We just really became less efficient across the board with that. So now, we have a strategy that we have in place to determine, what are our most critical needs when these things go down. And in some cases, what if we don't have access to digital items and we don't have a paper copy available? So even with our business continuity plan, there will be a paper copy somewhere in a safe in case we cannot get to it. So just those types of things. But yeah, it was interesting.
Yeah, so within going back to the military context, the people that run operations and then the people that support them, right? So you have supporting functions in communications or cybersecurity, we're in a supporting role. And there's somewhat of a disconnect oftentimes between IT or cybersecurity professionals and the people that actually run the organization. And it's the same way maybe in the city of Atlanta or any place else. I think that this particular situation that you went through, however, gives you the ability to communicate the value of what you provide as infrastructure and as a network and as capabilities to a city that had to experience it firsthand. So can you talk to maybe a little bit about how you're capitalizing on that value that now everybody in Atlanta really understands what the network provides or doesn't provide? And so what are you doing now to move forward, to posture yourself for the future? And then I'm sure that there are additional investments that are being made because of what happened.
Yeah, and I would say, as we have moved forward, we have really gotten to a space where where we're focusing on teachable moments. I think that our workforce, and I think the mayor has done an outstanding job supporting this along with my staff and team. I think that in every major situation, I think we have a workforce that is extremely aware of the potential threats that are out there. If I could say, that's the biggest thing we've been able to take advantage of. Yes, we do have situations where we kind of overdo it, where we say, hey, you can't do that because you might get a cyber attack. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get a cyber attack. But I think it's given us a lot of leverage, not only from an infrastructure perspective, but it allows us to. It has allowed us to whittle through what would typically be stuck in a political hold, and I think that's extremely important. I'm not going to say it's going to stay there, but having 19 individuals on city council, having a mayor, having politics that funnels through all of that, and really being able to move the needle forward, to progress. I think we've made a lot of ground using what took place as a leverageable moment to get things through. And so that's always been at the top of our mind. We want an item that we need to pay for. We're really using the fact that this will help strengthen our posture as we move forward from a cybersecurity perspective.
So we've talked a lot. I told you that, there's two aspects. There's the technology side and then the business process side. And we've talked a lot about the business process side. Let's talk a little bit about the technology side as we begin to wrap up. So from a technology perspective, security historically was an afterthought. Security was something that was bought after the infrastructure was purchased and was a bolt-on, some type of, additional key feature functionality, et cetera. How much now are you looking at the point products that you have? Because the more point products you deploy, those point products create gaps and seams in between them, and those gaps and seams are, vulnerable and open you up to vulnerability. So from that perspective, how are you approaching some type of security platform that's integrated? That's kind of what I deal with every day, is integrated architectures. And so how are you approaching the technology aspect moving forward?
Yeah, great question, and I think it's simple for us. We have a security strategy tied to every implementation at the beginning. You talked about it being an afterthought. Some of the first questions that are asked, are, from a security perspective, how are we going to handle this? I think the conversation has changed. It's at the beginning of the implementation stage. It's at the beginning of the testing stage. I had a conversation with my staff the other day, and we talked about how important the testing strategy is just as important as the implementation strategy. And so from a security perspective, as we move forward to implement, we're looking at the requirements of what we buy, even at that stage. There's a security strategy tied into that. And so it's moved from kind of the middle of the pack or the end of the pack, like, hey, let's get this stuff in and then let's worry about security, to the beginning of it. And so I think that is allowing us to think holistically a lot better about the things that we want to implement into our environment.
Absolutely. So last question. It's obvious that you're heading in the direction where security is interwoven into everything that you do, and that's kind of where you should be, without question. But lastly, how much is integration a big deal or a focus now for you? Because, like I said, going back to those gaps and seams, how much are you focused now on ensuring that everything that you have is integrated? because oftentimes I know that when I was in the government and we dealt with industry, there was a lot of discussions around just, purchase this or purchase that. But how much are you focused on making sure that everything you have is integrated into your security strategy and architecture?
Yeah, we're very focused on that. The city has hundreds and hundreds of applications. I'm not going to give a number, but you would be extremely surprised at the amount of applications that we have. And so, one of the things when we start talking about integration, we have a huge app rationalization project going on. And so that ties into, what we're going to kind of tolerate, what we're going to, mitigate, what we're going to kind of, innovate on. And so, the integration points to what we're working on and using is vital to that process. And just a simple example, at going through this business continuity exercise, it was extremely important that the platform that we use integrated with our service desk components. So we're looking at both. Just those types of things are being considered at the front end of the conversation.
Well, it seems like from the technology side to the people process side, you guys have made the most of this opportunity. You have lots of lessons learned. You're communicating those lessons learned to other government organizations so that they can learn them as well and not have to live what you live. Thank you for your time. Thank you, everyone, for your attention. One last parting comment as we get off the stage.
Yeah, what I would say is, and I always like to end with this, I have an amazing team and group of individuals, and I would be remiss to sit on this stage and not talk about them. The second thing is I am honored to work for what I feel like is the greatest mayor on the planet, and that's Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms. So thank you.
Thank you very much.